The autumn sun filtered through the aging oaks that lined our cul-de-sac, casting gentle, swaying shadows across my front lawn. Their leaves whispered secrets only the breeze could decipher. I'd bought this house for moments like these, sipping coffee on a quiet morning, watching the world wake up with a sort of unhurried grace. But tranquility, it seemed, had a price here, and that price was named Karen. Karen lived 2 houses down her property, a shrine to uniformity and strict adherence to the homeowners association's commandments. Her grass was always cut to regulation height, not a blade daring to defy her meticulous standards. Her flower beds were regimented rows of marigolds and petunias, each blooming in precise coordination, as though enlisted in nature's army. Karen was the self-appointed sentinel of our neighborhood's aesthetic, her gaze as relentless as the sun. It began with a note slipped into my mailbox, its edges sharp as if to slice through the calm. I unfolded it to find tidy looping script, a warning cloaked as courtesy. My dog Cooper, a gentle golden retriever with a soul too soft for this world, apparently barked too much for her liking. This was news to me, as Cooper preferred the language of tail wags and soulful eyes over barking. Karen's complaints escalated with military precision. A second note, then a third, each more insistent than the last. Her words were weapons aimed to puncture my peace. She threatened to report me to the HOA, a threat she wielded like a sword of justice. To her, rules were not merely guidelines but gospel, and she their vigilant apostle. The irony was not lost on me. Here I was embroiled in a suburban war over imaginary disturbances. Our neighborhood was a silent symphony, most days disturbed only by the occasional hum of a distant lawnmower. Cooper's bark, a rare joyful salute to a passing squirrel, was hardly the cacophony Karen claimed. But perception is reality, and in Karen's world, reality was suspect to her whims. I responded with patience. Each note met with a calm acknowledgement. I assured her that Cooper was well behaved, that I valued our community's peace as much as she did. I offered solutions willing to compromise, but her resolve was as unyielding as her pruned hedges, her gaze fixed on retribution rather than reconciliation. Yet I found amusement in the absurdity. Here we were adults squabbling over the sound of a dog's joy. It seemed almost fantastical, a tale spun from the threads of suburban satire. But reality often mimics fiction, and Karen was determined to play her part to the hilt. As autumn faded, winter crept in, dressing the oaks in frost and softening the world's edges, but not Karen's. Her resolve glinted sharp and cold, and when her ultimatum arrived, a threat to sue if Cooper's imagined disturbances did not cease, my mind had already begun to map the quiet revenge. I had no desire for confrontation, yet I was not one to be cowed by threats. The irony, my property line, long disputed, held the key to my response. Karen's fence strayed into my territory, a fact she conveniently ignored. I found solace in that knowledge, a chess piece waiting to be moved. So I prepared. Not with notes or threats, but with quiet determination. The stage was set, the pieces in place. Karen wanted a battle, and the terms she set would lead to her own undoing. The quiet of winter held its breath, waiting for the thaw and the revelation it would bring. Karen's threats had been the storm on the horizon, a distant rumble that suddenly struck like lightning. Her vendetta against my dog Max was merely the opening salvo in a campaign of absurdity. She wielded the HOA rulebook like an inquisitor's tome, dissecting it for infractions real or imagined. Her eyes sparkled with zeal as she patrolled the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, ready to pounce on the slightest deviation. The first citation landed in my mailbox with a thud as if its weight could crush my spirit. Grass length exceeding regulations. It read, an ironic accusation given I'd mowed just 2 days prior. Karen must have measured with a ruler, crouched like a hawk in the early morning dew, satisfied only when finding an errant blade. I let the letter sit on the counter, its presence nagging like an itch. Days later, another note arrived. Seasonal decorations displayed past approved time frame. I glanced at the single autumn wreath still hanging on my door. It was mid-November. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, but Karen had declared the festive season over. I imagined her issuing fines for wandering leaves that dared cross property lines. The neighborhood, once a tapestry of quiet cooperation, now buzzed with Karen's gossip. Her whispers slithered through hedges and under doors. I heard them in the rustle of curtains, the furtive glances at community gatherings. Unruly, she'd say, voice dripping with disdain, painting me as an outsider. My offense, owning a dog with an exuberant bark and a penchant for chasing squirrels. I watched neighbors pause at her front gate, nodding in conspiratorial agreement. They clutched shopping bags and leashes, eyes averted. Karen spun tales of my supposed infractions, weaving them with the precision of a master storyteller, each thread tightening around my reputation. Despite the absurdity, the rules persisted, a cascade of Kafkaesque citations. I filed them in a drawer, the papers accumulating like fallen leaves, crackling with potential energy. I marveled at the lengths she would go, the energy she expended on this personal crusade. A part of me almost admired her persistence, her dedication to a cause so petty it bordered on comical. Yet beneath my calm veneer simmered a quiet resolve. Her actions were a challenge, an invitation for retaliation cloaked in civility. I bided my time, knowing that the game she played had its weaknesses. A battle of paper and propriety, of landlines and legalities. Then, a moment of clarity. A plan formed in the stillness of a sleepless night. I reached for the land survey I'd commissioned years ago, a dusty document forgotten in a box. The boundary lines shifted under scrutiny, revealing a miscalculation in Karen's fortress. Her fence encroached a silent trespass. It was subtle and unnoticed, a line crossed both literally and figuratively. I filed the lawsuit quietly, like a pebble tossed into a pond, sending ripples through the community. The tide had turned. Her fortress, once impregnable, now stood vulnerable, exposed by her own overreach. In the days that followed, I moved with purpose. Calm, unyielding. Karen's fence line was no longer her castle wall, but a symbol of her downfall. The game had changed, and now it was my turn to dictate the rules. The night before my first court appearance, a calm settled over me like the quiet before a storm. I had spent every evening for weeks gathering evidence and meticulously piecing together a case as strong and unyielding as steel. Each document filed and each photograph cataloged was a brick in the fortress I was building to protect myself against Karen's relentless storm. Her threats had hung over me like a dark cloud, but I had learned to see through the mist, finding clarity in the chaos. Karen's obsession with power was evident as she patrolled the neighborhood, her eyes sharp, always hunting for the slightest infraction. My offensive dog had been nothing more than a pawn in her game, a convenient excuse to exert control. She pruned her roses with the precision of a surgeon, each snip purposeful and exacting. Yet against her meticulous facade I'd discovered the cracks. Her fence line, a symbol of her domineering control, was built 3 feet into my property, a subtle, silent overreach that would turn the tide. I had studied the property maps, scrutinizing every line, every inch of legalese until my eyes blurred, but my resolve sharpened. The moment I discovered her encroachment, it felt like finding an oasis in a desert of legal jargon. It was not just about reclaiming what was rightfully mine, but about restoring balance, about undermining the unjust reign she had imposed on the neighborhood. The courtroom was stark, its walls echoing the gravitas of the proceedings about to unfold. As I entered, I felt the eyes of justice weighing down impartial and indifferent. Karen arrived shortly after her entrance, as grandiose as one might expect from someone who reveled in spectacle. Her eyes met mine. A flicker of something was, it doubt crossing her face for the briefest of moments. The judge, a stoic figure presiding over the room, commanded respect with a mere glance. I presented my evidence with a calm I hadn't known I possessed. Each point was laid out with precision, each word measured akin to an artist laying the final strokes on a masterpiece. The irony of it all was not lost on me. Karen, who had sought to claim dominance with her incessant lawsuits and complaints, had unknowingly overstepped. The revelation of the misplaced fence was my coup de grace, delivered with the quiet dignity of someone who knows they stand on the precipice of victory. In that room the scales tipped. There was no need for grand speeches. The truth was stark enough to stand on its own. Karen's veneer of control cracked her eyes, flitting nervously to her lawyer, who whispered hurriedly into her ear. I leaned back, allowing the tide to sweep Karen along as she fumbled for control. Her empire of rules and regulations crumbled, leaving only silence in its wake. The irony was palpable. The woman who had threatened to sue over every imagined slight was now the one ensnared in the very net she had cast. In the days that followed, the neighborhood seemed lighter, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. Karen, still present, had lost the gleam of power in her gaze. Her roses bloomed as they always did, but no longer did she stand guard like a sentinel over her domain. As I walked my dog past the now repositioned fence, I couldn't help but smile at the poetic justice Karen had taught me, that sometimes the best revenge is not in the act itself, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing the storm has passed and the sun shines through. The chill of autumn crept into the cul-de-sac as leaves fluttered from the trees, painting the ground in shades of gold and rust. It was the calm before winter's breath, a prelude to the cold that would soon seep through gaps in old window frames. Yet the air felt heavier than usual, burdened by whispers and sideways glances that lingered like an early frost. Neighbors began to notice the new line drawn in the sand, quite literally. The surveyor's stakes marked the boundary with a precision that left little room for ambiguity. It was a silent declaration that even the most oblivious could not ignore. Karen's fence, a once proud, white picket symbol of suburban serenity, now sat awkwardly within my newly claimed plot. A few feet of grass, some soil she once assumed her own, had shifted allegiances. The tension was palpable, like a tightly wound spring ready to snap, or perhaps more like the unspoken tension before a thunderstorm breaks. There was an electricity in the air, a low hum of anticipation. I could feel it in the way the neighborhood children paused their games, eyes darting towards the boundary, as if it were an invisible force field they dared not breach. Karen's reaction was swift and predictable, a storm front of indignation that could be seen in the tightness of her jaw, the rigid set of her shoulders. Her morning rituals became a spectacle. She paced along her truncated fence line, her silhouette stark against the morning sun, casting long shadows that seemed to claw at the earth. It might have been comical had it not been so tragic in its desperation. There was irony here thick enough to cut with a knife. The fence intended as a barrier now imprisoned her in a way that transcended physical space. It encased her within a reality she had not chosen one thrust upon her by her own hubris. Her attempt to dictate had boomeranged with poetic precision. Meanwhile, I embraced the change with a quiet satisfaction, not out of spite but a sense of justice neatly served. It was as if the universe had adjusted itself to correct an imbalance. The ground beneath my feet felt more solid, the air crisper, clearer. There was a serenity in knowing that truth once unearthed could not be reburied. The neighborhood watched and waited a silent jury to this unfolding drama. Some offered sympathetic nods, others maintained a cautious distance. The unspoken understanding was that this was a conflict beyond their direct involvement, yet it rippled through the community like a stone cast into a pond. Karen attempted to maintain her authority, her power, but the cracks were showing visible in the way she hesitated before speaking, her voice lacking the conviction it once wielded. She was a queen, without a kingdom, a ruler whose domain had been reduced to a fraction of its former glory. Her attempts to rally support were met with polite smiles and non-committal responses. The people of this neighborhood valued their peace, their quiet lives untouched by the storms of such disputes. They were spectators, not participants. And in those rare moments when our paths crossed, there was a shared understanding, a mutual acknowledgement of the absurdity of it all. In the end, it was just a fence, a mere sliver of land, but it represented so much more. Boundaries, both physical and metaphorical, had been redrawn. The neighborhood had shifted ever so slightly on its axis, creating a new balance, a new normal. And in the grand tapestry of suburban life, this was but a single thread. Yet it was a thread that had been tugged, unraveling hidden tensions, revealing truths long buried beneath the manicured lawns and cheerful facades. Time would settle the dust as it always does. But for now, the air was charged, the stage set for whatever came next. And as I watched the leaves dance across the newly defined border, I understood that some battles are fought not with weapons, but with quiet resolve and the steadfastness of knowing one's place in the world. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting long striped shadows on the wooden floor. Each beam seemed like a reminder of the lines we draw, and those we sometimes must cross. I sat at the dining table staring at the crisp legal documents that lay before me like a quiet revolution wrapped in black ink. The lawsuit I'd filed against Karen was a calculated move, not an act of vengeance but of necessity. Her threats had been the catalyst, her disdain for my dog merely the tip of a much larger iceberg. Her attempts to control the neighborhood through the HOA had left the community in her grip, and it was time to loosen those fingers. The irony of it all was not lost on me. Karen's precious fence line, the boundary she guarded more jealously than a dragon with its hoard, would soon be redefined. The surveyor's report, meticulous and unforgiving, showed Her fence encroached on my property by a solid 2 feet. 2 feet! She had claimed as hers 2 feet that whispered a truth she couldn't deny. Legal filings are sterile things devoid of emotion, yet they carry the weight of consequence. I imagined her receiving the papers, the gasp of disbelief, the rapid reddening of her cheeks, an emperor dethroned by the simplest of truths. Yet, this was not about humiliation. It was about reclaiming space, both literal and metaphorical. My breath felt lighter, my chest less burdened. Sometimes justice is a quiet thing, a reshaping of boundaries rather than a battle cry. The legal proceedings unfolded with the kind of deliberate precision that only the law can muster. It felt like watching a glacier move slow, unstoppable. Meanwhile, I carried on, walked my dog along the paths we knew so well, each step a silent testament to resilience. There was an unexpected solidarity from neighbors who approached with nods and brief words of encouragement. It seemed Karen's reign had left many longing for change. Her threats, once a cloud over my home, now seemed to dissipate into whispers. On the day the decision arrived, I found myself standing beside the garden, the flowers nodding gently in the breeze, as if in quiet acknowledgement of what was to come. The ruling was in my favor. The fence would be moved, the lines redrawn on paper and on land. In the days that followed, the workmen came. The fence, once a symbol of Karen's dominion, was dismantled, plank by plank. I watched from my porch, feeling the slow, satisfying unraveling of a tightly wound knot. I imagined Karen watching, too, from a distance, the fortress she'd built reduced to a pile of timber. She remained silent, a queen without her crown, perhaps contemplating the cost of her crusade. And as for me, I found peace in the spaces she'd tried to claim. Walking my dog across the reclaimed strip of land, I understood that sometimes the most profound victories are those fought not with swords, but with quiet resolve. The world seemed a little larger now, boundaries redefined, possibilities endless. In the shadow of the setting sun, I sat back down at the table, a cup of tea in hand, and allowed myself the smallest of smiles. The air felt different, now lighter somehow, lines redrawn, life reclaimed, and somewhere beyond the stars began to appear steadfast and eternal, indifferent to the lines below. The courtroom's echo seemed exaggerated, a hollow sort of punctuation to the absurdity of the whole ordeal. I sat there enveloped in a silence that was more comforting than oppressive. It was the silence of resolve, like the quiet that follows a storm named Karen. The judge, an unassuming man with a weathered face that could have told 1,000 stories, looked over his glasses. His eyes flickered between the pages of what was now a substantial file, thick with the weight of community grievances and petty disputes inflated into legal battles. Our neighborhood saga was buried somewhere in there, though today it was the only story that seemed to matter. Karen sat across the room. Her presence was a sharp contrast to the calm, like a too bright color in an otherwise muted painting. Her expression was both defiant and uneasy, a mask that had begun to crack. Her previous confidence a veneer of authority. She wore like an overstarched suit was unraveling thread by thread. The courtroom proceedings unfolded like a carefully constructed play. Lawyers presented evidence, spoke in terms too abstract for the emotional reality that had driven us here. My own lawyer, precise and measured, laid out the facts with a quiet confidence that mirrored my own approach to this ordeal. The fence line, the surveys, the encroachments, all meticulously documented, every detail. a brick in the sturdy wall of our case. Karen's counter-arguments were feeble, mere whispers against the gale of evidence. Her complaint about my dog, once delivered with the fervor of a preacher at a pulpit, now seemed trivial and misplaced echoes of a campaign that had lost its direction. Inside, I reflected on the path I had taken to this moment. It was strange how something as simple as a fence line could become a battlefield, a place where boundaries were not just physical, but also personal, a metaphorical line in the sand that Karen and I had drawn between duty and tyranny. My mind wandered to the neighborhood, the real victim in this saga, a place once vibrant with the laughter of children and the quiet camaraderie of shared sidewalks. It had been disrupted, a pond rippled by a single, deliberate stone. But I knew deep down that ripples could eventually subside, leaving only a memory of disturbance that faded with time. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the reverie. His words were measured, precise, carrying the weight of finality. Our claims were validated, the evidence irrefutable. Karen's fence line was to be redrawn, her authority curtailed, her role diminished. The irony was thick as molasses. A self-proclaimed guardian of order now found herself on the outskirts of the very community she sought to control. In the hallway outside, the air felt different, lighter. Karen passed by, her eyes avoiding mine. There was something almost pitiable in her defeat, like a bird that had flown headfirst into a glass wall, stunned by its own miscalculation. I didn't need words to savor the victory. The moment spoke volumes. Back home, the sun cast a warm glow over the newly drawn lines. My dog bounded over to me, oblivious to human pettiness, his joy uncontained and infectious. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and clear. As I looked over my reclaimed space, a sense of peace settled over me. Not just because the battle was won, but because the community was ours again. Undivided, I realized that true power lay not in control, but in understanding, in knowing when to stand firm and when to let go. And sometimes, in the silence that follows, that's when you find your true voice.